Hi there, everyone, or whoever is watching this sermon. My name is Grant Summers. I'll be doing a sermon on Isaiah chapter 2. Sorry for the poor quality of the video. I'm doing it both via Zoom and on my very old laptop, so have some grace. But let's get into it. And I'll start by reading out the passage, and we'll go from there. So, this is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. You, Lord, have abandoned your people. The descendants of Jacob, they are full of superstitions from the east. They practice divination like the Philistines and embrace pagan customs. Their land is full of silver and gold. There is no end to their treasures. Their land is full of horses. There is no end to their chariots. Their land is full of idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their fingers have made, so that people will be brought low and everyone humbled. Do not forgive them. Go into the rocks, hide in the ground from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty. The eyes of the arrogant will be humbled, and human pride brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. The Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty, for all that is exalted, and they will be humbled. For all the cedars of Lebanon, tall and lofty, and the oaks of Bashan, for all the towering mountains and the high hills, for every lofty tower and every fortified wall, for every trading ship and every stately vessel. The arrogance of man will be brought low, and human pride humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, and idols will totally disappear. People will flee to caves in the rocks and the holes of the ground, uh, from the fearful presence of the Lord, and the splendor of his majesty when he rises up to shake the earth. In that day, people will throw away to the moles and bats their idols of silver and of gold, which they made to worship. They will flee to the caverns in the rocks and to the overhanging crags from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he rises to shake the earth. Stop trusting in mere humans who have but a breath in their nostrils. Why hold them in esteem? I think one of the major things in this passage, despite just how often awe-inspiring it is, to just kind of how fearsome and powerful is the Lord. Obviously, we know that Isaiah is a prophet. He's one of the prophetic texts, and he is talking about the fall of Israel before the exile. Um, and he is prophesying that they will fall. But one of the things that I think ought to be highlighted in this passage is that there's somewhat of a parallelism going on here between verse 4 and verses 8 through 9. So I'll read those again and we'll kind of compare. So in verse 4 it says, "He will judge between the nations and will settle dispute for many peoples." So we see there that essentially the Lord will make peace among the nations. And then he goes on to say, "They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war." So we now have established God is going to settle the disputes of the nations, and the nations will turn their weapons into tools for labor. And I think that this is, first off, something that initially should bring us great peace. to believe that God is going to do away with all violence, and that the only thing that we will need to worry about is doing the work of the land. Um, but then we go into verse 7, 8, and 9, and we see kind of this corruption. So in verse 7 through 9, it says this: Their land is full of silver and gold. There is no end to their treasures. Their land is full of horses. There is no end to their chariots. Their land is full of idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their fingers have made. So people will be brought low, and everyone humbled. Do not forgive. So initially, we have this kind of building up of the ability to do labor. It is God saying, "No more will you fight, but rather there will be labor." I think that a lot of people will talk about this kind of idea that when God returns, there will be no labor. I'm not sure if that's established in the canon, but one of the things that we're talking about is that there will be no more war. All we will have to do is tend to the fields. But then on the other side of this, only in a couple verses later, God shows that the people of God now, even if they are not fighting, have found a way to misplace their trust in the land, that they bow down to the work of their hands and what their fingers have made. Um, this is somewhat of an interesting parallelism because it shows that even in God's peacemaking, we have found a way to corrupt it. And then immediately the scripture goes into showing God's might and his power, that the only thing that one can do is flee. There's not even asking for forgiveness, for they will not be forgiven. It is the only time is to run and to be in fear. Um, and so in verse 5 is the other parallel that we should talk about, is verse 5 and then verse, I believe it's 22. It's the last verse of the chapter. So in verse 5 it says, "Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." And this is kind of what separates those two passages of they will turn their weapons into tools, and then those tools have still corrupted them. There's somewhat of a chiastic structure going on there. But in verse 5, we have, "Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord," which then brings us down to verse 22, which says, "Stop trusting in mere humans who have but breath in their nostrils. Why hold them in esteem?" If you're looking through this passage and you're trying to find what's the main point, what am I, if I'm digging through this passage, where am I going to get spat out? What's my conclusion? I think Isaiah puts it pretty plain and simple right there at the end. We see that man is full of anger, war, and even without war, has found a way to corrupt himself in the labor of his hands, which draws us all back to the idea that there's nothing that man can do on his own that cannot be corrupted. So then what do we do if we can no longer trust in men? We must now give only our devotion to Yahweh. Stop trusting in mere humans who have only breath in their nostrils. Why hold them in esteem? God is our only hope. He's the only thing that we can put our trust in, our faith in. And I think Isaiah makes it very clear that through this passage, all of the gold, all of the things that we would put esteem in our life, all these things mean nothing in the eyes of God. And as such, we should put no care and no trust into them. It is through God alone that we are saved, that we are sustained. The breath of our lungs is from him. So certainly we have breath in our lungs, but that's all we have in our lungs. We're not capable of doing any more. Why trust in men? We can't.